I coordinate the STEAM project, and the acronym already tells us which is the focus of the project itself, which are geological volatiles of particular environmental interest. These the volatiles on which we concentrate are in particular radon and the COH fluid species. So this means the fluids in the system carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, which include in particular methane and CO2, which are two of the most important greenhouse gases. The project focuses both on the emissions and on their sources, and therefore it is split in 4 parts. The first part on emission is related on methane and hydrogen emissions in a zone of the Eastern Alps that is called Valpusteria. In this area, recent investigations by a young researcher from this department, Eleonora Benà, have shown that there are particularly high concentration of hydrogen and methane emissions, much greater than the average. And therefore, we want to focus on the origin of those methane and hydrogen, and in order to understand if the emissions have a shallow source or a deep source. With this project, we also want to explore if there's any relationship between hydrogen and methane and radon, because in the same area we have also analyzed and measured the radon emissions. And one of the targets is to understand if there will be a correlation so that hydrogen can be used as a tracer for radon emissions. The second line of research on emissions is focused on radon, in particular on radon risk. Again, in the same area of Valpusteria, we have analyzed in the last years the emissions of radon over a large area, and radon emissions have been correlated to the presence and activity of important tectonic lines. The existing mapping over this area of radon emissions allows to understand and quantify the geological radon potential and to evaluate a collective risk for the populations. Based on the maps of geological radon potential, we will help policymakers to implement policies of mitigation of risk and also of sustainable urban planning. Concerning the sources of these volatiles, we want to focus on the two most important greenhouse gases, which are carbon dioxide and methane. And we want to understand how these volatiles behave in the deep crust, so where they are originated before they enter in magmas and they are emitted at the surface during eruptions. In order to do that, we will do experiments in our laboratories simulating the partial melting of a crust, of a sedimentary crust containing graphite. The geological graphite has been overlooked in the past by researchers in the studies of global carbon cycle. And we want to focus and try to focus on graphite and try to fill this gap of knowledge. By these experiments, we will measure the content of COH species in magmas and in the fluids during the melting of the crust, and these carbonic species are those which will be emitted by subsequent eruptions. The final research line of the project is based on the results of the experimental strategy of the previous research line, and owing to the new knowledge on solubility of COH species in magmas, we will perform some numerical modeling of the quantification of volatile emissions during two geological processes. One is the contact metamorphism of graphitic lithologies around shallow intrusions, and the second is the infiltration of hot hydrothermal fluids within the same lithologies. In both circumstances, there is the production of significant quantities of both methane and CO2. And by our numerical models, we want to quantify these emissions and to compare the volumes and amounts generated with those generated by other geological processes, which are nowadays considered as the most relevant in producing this kind of greenhouse gases.